if that's your question, the rational basis review, a law that is justified by a desire to promote governmental efficiency and a desire to harm some popular group will be upheld. Give another few seconds. All right. Who's next? Sorry. What's your thoughts here, my friend?
My guest lecture today probably was when I use the board. People just always get marker on my jacket.
Sorry, what's your answer here?
Okay.
I'm not sure because I don't understand.
So let's just break this down for a second, Rosario, okay? We have different motives, right? When a law is enacted, lots of people vote on it. And sometimes people vote on it for different reasons, right? So let's say there are just, make it easy, there are 10 members of the legislature, 5 vote on it for one reason, and 5 vote on it for another reason. Make it easy, right? 5 and 5. Let's say 5 of them voted for the law because they think they'll make government more efficient, things will run a little more smoothly, right? They have no malice aforethought, right? Nothing bad in their heart. But then you got another 5 who are like, yeah, we don't care about efficiency, screw these people, right? This unpopular group, let's just stick it to them. What's a court to do in that situation where there's evidence in the record, 5 and 5, and give you numbers just like that? Does it matter for a rational basis review? Adiana, want to take a stab at this?
That doesn't matter if it's a rational basis?
That's your question, right? That's your question. What's your answer there?
I think that is true, but if it has a desire to promote governmental efficiency, I think it's again an issue of like if the means should meet the end or fit the ends. If there is a legitimate level end for governmental efficiency, then under rational basis, yes.
All right, let me give you another I'll give you another example, okay? Let's say you have an employment position. Now, you haven't taken an employment law, I'll just give you an example, right? You have a boss who goes around saying, you know what, I hate all women are awful employees, right? And then he goes and fires an employee. But it turns out that employee hadn't showed up for work in a month and had been doing a really, really bad job. And the employee brings a discrimination claim, saying, you fired me because I'm a woman. And the boss goes, well, I said all these things about women, but you didn't show up to work for a month and you didn't do your job.
Mm-hmm.
How are you supposed to handle these mixed motivation cases?
Well, sorry, I forgot the name of the case. But in Romer, it was addressed in the dissent, and it says that I think what stood out to me was like that would be a matter of taking sides in political wars.
Jay, your hand up a minute ago?
Yes, I just wanted to relate this back to rational basis. You said when we're analyzing the scope of rational basis, we have to analyze whether the governmental program is rationally related. And you also said we show deference, but the government almost always wins. So in this instance, although one seemingly is conflicting with 2, if you can show that the unpopular group has a governmental issue, then it will overrule the 1 because you have to have some type of relation to a government desire to win.
And so, Jay, let's sit there for a minute, right? Your next words aren't close enough, right? What if, though, you can show that for at least half the people voted on this bill, they did think that this law issue promoted efficiency, and you can show the other half didn't really give a damn?
But the first half did have government.
Yeah, and they had a sincere belief, and they put it forward in the record, and it's not controversial.
Well, although I don't agree with it, under rational basis review.
Right. So let me go on to John, right? We talked about Caroline products, right? Remember our favorite footnote 4. Footnote 4 is basically your guideline of when you jump to strict scrutiny, right? Generally, you give a rational basis review, but if there's certain things triggered, right? So it said if there's some restriction that implicates the Bill of Rights, you go to strict scrutiny. It says if it distorts the political process, you go into strict scrutiny. And there's that bit we always remember about the discrete and the insular minorities, right? There's some law that affects them. And we read in Cleaver, right? We read Cleaver, right? We read in Cleaver, did we? Let's do that properly. I do both classes. I can't remember. We did Cleaver, right? Where you have mentally handicapped people. The court says, well, we're not saying that they're discrete and insular, but we're still giving rational basis review. So we have all these precedents that are seeming to cut that generally says, once you're in rational basis review, if you got a good motivation and you got a bad motivation, you have these mixed motivations, right? As long as there's some good basis, the law's upheld. But then what do we do in the case where we have, again, 5 people saying legitimate reason, and 5 people giving, sticking to this unpopular group? How should the court understand when the law has mixed motivations?
Well, going back to your employment question where you fired a woman who had been absent for a month, I suppose, and analyzing it in that frame, you could still say, okay, this is the standard that's upheld across the board, and this equal protection, despite there's another motive that might be sinister or something like that. The driving motive in that particular situation is one that is legitimate based on work efficiency, and I think I can take the place, but it's not very clear. I think that's the point.
Right. So this is a common problem in law. It's what's called mixed motives, right? If you ever take an employment law discrimination class, it's what's called mixed motives discrimination. And the example I gave to Adiyami is a very classic example, right? You have some boss who goes spouting out saying, oh my God, I hate women. And then you have a woman who's fired, and she hasn't been at work in a month, right? And there's actually a fairly credible reason that she hasn't served her job anymore. So how is a judge supposed to balance whether this is just a pretense, right, that they fired her because she's a woman, citing this absenteeism, or is it a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason why she's fired? The woman didn't show up to work for a month, right? So there's no good reason, or I'm sorry, there's no good line to divide it. I think the 3 or 4 of you are more or less hitting on it, right? What do you do in a case where you have an argument that there's some traditional reason, some legitimate reason why you're doing it, and then some other reasons just you don't like someone, right? You have these different sorts of motivations. Okay? So with me so far. All right. So now the second part of my question is, let's just focus on government efficiency for a minute. And I want to talk about Windsor, which is signed all the way at the end, but we'll get there a little bit later. The Defense of Marriage Act, right, is this big law that was passed in the 1990s. It does a lot of things. But one of the things that it does is it says, for purposes of federal law, marriage is one man and one woman. Okay, now, there are lots of reasons why this law is enacted, but there's actually a very easy reason why. When you get married, say Massachusetts legalizes same-sex marriage, right? And then a couple gets married in Massachusetts, okay? Then that couple moves to Texas where it's not legal. And the couple wants to file a federal tax return. Do they file it under the definition in Massachusetts? Or do they file it under the definition in Texas? And make the example real. Let's say you spent half the year living in Massachusetts and then half the year living in Texas, right? And you want to file a tax return as married. So what DOMA said is, listen, we're not going to deal with this sort of confusing issues. We're going to have one definition nationwide. Doesn't matter where you're moving from, single definition. Okay. Now, is that the only reason why DOMA was enacted? Of course not. Is that the predominant reason why DOMA was enacted? Probably not. But is that a reason why DOMA was enacted? Yeah, and there's history to that effect. It's to eliminate the problems when you have different definitions in different states. You have one definition nationwide for federal law. Now, does that treat gay and lesbians differently? Yeah, I'm not getting into that now. But efficiency of government processes, that is, if you have a federal tax return, You don't need 50 different regimes and 50 different rules to apply. That is something the federal government often does, right? Set a single standard nationwide. But then what do if you have the Defense of Marriage Act? And one of the reasons is to say we want to make the IRS and other agencies have efficient processes. And then the other part of the history says we want to express some moral disapproval of gay marriage, right? We want to express a disapproval of these sorts of marriages. How do you handle that exact case where you have competing interests? One is legitimate, no one doubts that. But the second one, at least the court says, is not legitimate, right? These are the mixed motive cases, right? In a sense, in Romer and Windsor were much easier cases because the government's justification there was pretty weak, right? Why they want to ban sodomy, why do they want to change the Colorado ordinances? Like, they didn't have very good reasons, other than we don't need a reason. But when you get to Windsor, there actually was a fairly legitimate technical reason why they had this law. And the court said, well, Justice Kennedy, that's not enough to overcome part number 2, right? The fact that there's some bad overweighs whatever good is part of the law. And I remind you, all the cases we're studying today, Romer, Lawrence, Windsor, all 3 cases are under rational basis review. Right? This is why I told you a week or so ago, scrutiny doesn't matter anymore. It never mattered to Justice Kennedy. He doesn't like talking about it. He's in denial of some sort, right? So when you look at the way the court scrutinized the Colorado law, the Texas sodomy statute, and the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, they're employing what I could only call strict scrutiny. You have to be candid and honest what they're doing. They're saying, we don't care even if there's a legitimate existence in the record, a good reason, deficiency. We're going to disregard that. Because this part 2 is there, right? The second interest, we're going to strike it down. Even though under traditional rational basis review, so long as the government puts forward a rational basis why this could be legal, that's enough. It doesn't have to be even the real reason. It could just be a reason that could justify it. Hell, courts can make up reasons under rational basis review. But in the 3 cases today, Romer, Lawrence, and Windsor, they say we're going to disregard traditional reasons, the rational basis. Have you your hand up?
I'm just trying to understand because you're saying that they were under rational basis review, but as I read it, and as you just stated, they employed more of a strict scrutiny.
They did.
Needs, like that's why.
Did the word
that's
strict?
Where my notes came.
Did the word strict scrutiny appear anywhere in your readings for today?
No.
Anywhere? Not a place. Not one word.
No, but they hinted at it. That.
I do want you want to yeah.
Okay.
Did the majority say that though? So here's the rule, right? And we'll get there. But again, and I can give this to you very simply. Justice Kennedy doesn't really care about scrutiny. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter to him. He feels belabored to mention it. It's not important to him. For him, he decides who lives, who dies, who gets married, who doesn't, right? He makes all very tough decisions for us. Why vote? But for Justice Kennedy, the key word is dignity. You'll see this more in the Bergefell case, but also you see a little bit in Windsor. That if some law deprives someone of their dignity, or to use the word I use here, if a law is based on desire to harm, right? This phrase keeps popping up, a desire to harm, right? That is where it runs afoul. So everyone with me so far? Any questions on this introductory? This question more or less describes the next 90 minutes of class. If you get this much, it works the class. Anyone else?
So
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just still kind of like, was it rational basis review, but they used strict scrutiny instead? So they just do what they want, pretty much? Or that's where I'm kind of
The
like,
majority in Romer says it's rational basis review.
right.
In Lawrence, they basically say it's rational basis review. By the time he gets to Windsor, they don't bother saying that. But they don't ever say, well, Adiana, let me ask you a question. You make a good point. In order for strict scrutiny to be applied on the due process clause, what must be present? You could review. Right? When do you apply strict scrutiny under the due process clause? What must be present? Anyone know the answer I'm looking for? Yeah, David?
You're impinging on the
Oh.
Bill of Rights for some group.
Close, but David?
Fundamental right?
Bingo. right? Fundamental right. Under the due process clause, you only get to strict scrutiny if you deal with a fundamental right. Adiami, does the court ever say that sodomy is a fundamental right? Did they ever actually say that in any of the opinions? No, ma'am. Okay. Second, when do you get to strict scrutiny for your protection? What must be present? Right, it's a good review for your final, guys. When do you apply strict scrutiny under the equal protection clause? What must be present? Yes, Crystal?
Race.
What kind of classification is race? What do we call that?
Suspect.
Capital K, suspect, yes. All right. Suspect classification. Right? When you have a suspect classification, like race, Crystal's correct, you give to strict scrutiny. And Adiami, I'll come back to you. Does the court ever say that sexual orientation is a suspect classification? No, ma'am, it does not. So our two triggers for strict scrutiny, right? Under the due process clause, you show fundamental right. Under protection, you show suspect classification. Those are our triggers for strict scrutiny. Neither is triggered in any of the cases, right? If the court just came out and said, sexual orientation is a suspect class, okay, you apply strict scrutiny, right? They said, sodomy is a fundamental right, okay, you have strict scrutiny. They don't do any of that. Again, Kennedy doesn't care about strict scrutiny. He doesn't care about suspect classifications. He doesn't care about fundamental rights. All that stuff is irrelevant to him, which is why teaching this topic is so, I know, difficult for all of you. It's like, Blackman, what the hell's the rule? I'm telling you, I don't know, right? Josh doesn't know either. I have no idea, guys. But this is the world we live in. If this wasn't clear enough in Windsor, when you read a Bergerfelder class next on Thursday, it'll become a lot more clear. Because in that case, Justice Kennedy goes full hog on dignity. That's his magic word. Yes, ma'am.
So to recap what you said for Justice Kennedy, he just views that if some law deprives a group of their dignity, then
It's unconstitutional.
Okay.
Jay just summarized it very well. If a law deprives a person of dignity, it's unconstitutional. What does that mean? We'll talk about it next week or next class. But the court hasn't recognized a new fundamental right in a couple decades. The court hasn't added a new suspect classification in a couple decades. Right? It just doesn't do that anymore. Now think of like Bowers, right? What was he thinking of Bowers? They said sodomy is not a fundamental right, therefore strict scrutiny does not apply. Therefore, we're in rational basis review. And under rational basis review, we uphold the sodomy statute because we have a moral interest in keeping people from engaging in these sex acts. Done. That, 30 years ago, passed for constitutional law, no longer. So, again, there's never been an opinion saying we don't do scrutiny anymore, right? There's no opinion saying we don't do fundamental rights, but it doesn't happen anymore. The court just doesn't talk about it. It's a weird day for law students, but even weirder for me. You look so perplexed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I wish I could give you a better answer, but I can't. Let's see if we can put here. Oh, interesting. Yeah. I think. Let me put it this way: if you're in Justice Kennedy's world, this is correct. If you're in the pre-Justice Kennedy world, this is correct. So I think all of you are happily inside Justice Kennedy's world, right? The answer is false, right? That it's not constitutional under Kennedy's rubric. So if you're putting false, you're following AMK. That's Anthony Michael Kennedy. Not Anthony Michael Hall, Anthony Michael Kennedy. Okay. Questions on the introduction before we go to the next case? All right, Lacey, you're up. Want to give me the facts, please, and Romer B. Evans?
Yes, so Colorado voters adopted Amendment 2 to their state constitution, which prevented homosexuals and lesbians and bisexual orientation in their relationships and stuff from having any protection under, or any laws to protect them under their state constitution.
Okay, very good. Let me ask you a follow-up question, please. What happened before Amendment 2 that created the movement to enact this amendment to the Constitution?
In Colorado or Colorado?
Colorado, yeah, exactly. What preceded it? Why did Colorado enact Amendment 2? What came first? Rachel?
there were other state laws that were put in place to protect homosexuals from discrimination.
Were these state laws
They were state laws, I believe.
enacted by,
Colorado.
not the state,
Oh.
who enacted these laws? Lacey?
Federal?
No, not federal.
Cities?
Oh, local.
Cities? Local?
Yeah, both of you walk into it. City, very good. So what happened was in Colorado, a few cities, Aspen, Boulder, Denver, right, enacted ordinances that prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation in public housing, employment, education, and other aspects of government. Okay? For example, let's say two men were living together. There's no marriage. Let's say two men were in a relationship, they're living together, and they applied to public housing. All right? Under Denver law at the time of these ordinances, the city could not deny this couple public housing together simply because they were gay. Okay? So these laws were enacted. But then an amendment was put on the ballot. The same that we have. Did everyone vote today? Did everyone vote today?
I'm going later.
Go vote, please. It's stressing me not to vote. Anyway, go vote. Today's election day. Or vote. Go vote. So there was an amendment put on the ballot. I forgot to tell my property class. Damn it. Failed. I failed as a teacher. Go vote. An amendment was put on the ballot. It was called Amendment 2. And what this amendment would do is prevent the cities from extending these sorts of protections, right? It didn't require discrimination against gays and lesbians. What it said is that cities like Aspen and Denver can't add to the list of protected classes sexual orientation. So everyone understand what this amendment did? Okay, no, I can't remember. Jessica, are you next? I don't want to call him Eric. He gets mad at me. It's a good reason. I try to be fair. Jessica, you're up next. So what was the government's rationale? Or, let's put it this way. What was the rationale behind Amendment number 2? Why was this, forget Justice Kennedy for a minute, right? Why was this amendment put forward?
Well, they said that it put gays and lesbians in the same position as everyone else.
What do you mean? I think you're right. Say it again, please. Why was this amendment put in the ballot?
It just didn't give homosexuals any special rights.
Well, that's true. That's the effect of this. Why was this put on the ballot? Well, okay, yeah. I mean, it got rid of the ordinances, but why was there a desire to get rid of the ordinance? There you go. We're close. Daniel, I think it's that.
Morality,
What do you mean morality?
some people find that immoral.
Okay. So, what does this law do to morality? How does this law promote morality?
Ensuring the status quo.
So, okay, so maintaining the traditional definition of marriage, right? But these ordinances didn't legalize gay marriage. It just said if you're two men living together, you can go live in public housing together, right? It doesn't legalize it, doesn't give any status or anything. How does this law promote morality?
By preventing any legislative or judicial or executive classification that would prevent them from.
You're on that track, Andrew. You want to take a step?
It gives people who have an objection to homosexuality, like, a reason to be able to discriminate against homosexuals.
I think, say that again. I think you said it just a little unclear. Say it again, please.
Like it allows people to discriminate.
Ah, that's what I thought you meant.
Homosexuals.
So you're saying that this ensures that people can continue to
Yes,
treat gays and lesbians differently.
on a religious basis, or like, whoever, for whatever reason they want to discriminate against, mostly religious.
Okay. And then what's the effect of this? Like, why would government want to do this? Why would the government want this power?
Why would the government want the power to discriminate against gays?
I swear for purpose, you're asking for purpose, but follow me down the trail here.
Because their voters want them to discriminate against gays?
What are they afraid of in the 1990s?
Oh, like moral degradation of society?
What would happen if gays get this discrimination protection? What might be next?
Oh,
See, I'm going.
they might start like demanding special rights again.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm trying to figure out where I was going with this, right? So there are probably a lot of different potential motivations for this ordinance, right, for this amendment, right? One of which I think Andre said is to allow people to continue discriminating against gays and lesbians. That's certainly true. But the other motivation I think Scalia jumps on in his dissent is to simply preserve the status quo. Because if you start providing protections in employment and housing for gays and lesbians, next thing you know, they might start asking for recognition of civil union, and then that leads to gay marriage. So perhaps these laws are designed solely to maintain the traditional status quo. Andre.
I thought it was interesting that he called them tolerant Coloradans.
Scalia, you're talking about?
Yeah, Scalia.
Yeah.
Tolerant Coloradans, preserving traditional sexual mores against the efforts of a politically powerful minority.
Oh, I was going to get there in a bit, but yeah. What's he talking about there?
He's saying that it's like the political agenda. I think he talks about it later.
He does.
Yeah.
He does. He uses that exact phrase.
Subverting society.
You don't think it had anything to do with AIDS and the rise?
Well, he does mention health risks, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Everyone notice that? So this is by the time of the 1990s, so AIDS wasn't quite the sort of thing it was in the 80s, but he does mention health risks.
It would still believe to like, respect like homosexual kind of things.
Right. So I'm going to actually get there in a minute, but one of the possible motivations along the lines that Andre said is that this was premised on preserving morality, allowing them to continue treating gays and lesbians different. Mark.
Maybe I misinterpreted things, but I thought that Scalia's dissent was just there shouldn't be a box that they can tick that allows them to go into a minority group. If you're applying for public housing, you should be able to tick minority status as homosexual. I thought that the policy of Amendment 2 was that you don't get any special treatment based off of sexual orientation.
Oh, Mark, that's my next question, right? So these are all the, all the rationale number 2, right? These are the bare. So the question, the Andre answer was number 2, right? Andre was number 2, right? Jonathan, what's number 1, right? What are the? Say you're a tolerant Coloradan, right? Or maybe along Mark's question, what are some of the positive, non-hateful, perhaps, rationale why someone might have voted for? And keep in mind, right, when people go to vote in the ballot box, they don't give a reason why. They just vote 1 or 2. Right? They don't give a legislative history. So Jonathan, what might be a positive rationale why the voters of Colorado might enact this sort of regime? Let's be charitable for a minute, right? Let's be, maybe people were good natured, have other reasons for doing this. Step.
Good reason, but to counter like the Scalia says like there's like a concentration of homosexual, I guess, with like disproportionate political power. There's a lot of the other side can like challenge that in a way.
Maybe. Zach, want to take a step?
It's governmental efficiency. You could be avoiding potentially making them like a suspect class and have people bringing suits for discrimination.
So they want to decrease the amount of litigation. Is that what your point is? Mm-hmm. Is decreasing the amount of litigation against the state a legitimate interest? Anthony, you want to try another one?
For voting for Amendment 2?
Yeah, of what's perhaps, you know, a non-hateful reason why a person might vote for Amendment 2?
Because it would kind of put them at a disadvantage,
But who?
homosexuals.
Well, that's reason number 2, right? That's the desire to harm. Anthony, let me ask you a question. Let's say you run a business in Colorado, and let's say you work in HR, and you have, say, restaurants in every city in Colorado, right? And then you have, you know, one set of employment rules in Denver, and then another set of employment rules in Pueblo. Is there anything problematic about that?
Yeah, because you should have a different type of system in each city.
So what if the government says we want to create a single set of employment discrimination laws statewide to prevent the sort of confusion that could arise when each town and county has different laws?
Yeah, I think it would promote efficiency because then there's only one law to.
There it is, right?
govern.
So perhaps one of the reasons why this law could be supported is to give a single statewide standard with respect to sexual orientation. That way, if you run businesses in different cities, you don't have to deal with varied regimes. This happens all the time. A lot of states have laws that prevent municipalities from making their own discrimination laws. Because imagine if you're running a business in, you know, just the Houston area. You have the Harris County Code, you have the Katy Code, right? You have the Sugar Land Code, right? It's complicated dealing with all these competing laws. Now, we've given sort of the good reasons why this law we voted, and the bad reason why. Case, if you had to guess, what predominated public deliberations over Amendment 2? Was it trying to make efficient regulations with unified laws, or moral disapproval of gays and lesbians?
Moral.
Yeah. So this is Justice Kennedy's opinion. He makes his point, I think pretty clearly. By the way, who is Romer? Romer was the governor of Colorado at the time. So if you go and look at some of the advertisements for voting, the caption is hard to read. It says, "Stop special class status for homosexuality." And this is an advertisement from the Colorado for Family Values group urging people to vote yes on Amendment 2. And it depicts a parade marchers holding up a sign that says S&M letter contingency. You know, S&M is sadomasochism, right? It's Google it. Later, Google it. You're gonna get me in trouble. But anyway, my point is, if you look, oh God, thank God your daughter's not here today. Mommy, what is S&M? If you look at the public debate concerning the amendment number 2, it was primarily from rationale number 2, right? Not rationale number 1. So the question becomes this, right? If we're under rational basis review, is having this mixed motive enough to uphold it? You have the good reasons and you have the, not so good reasons. And traditionally the answer is that's enough to uphold it. But starting in Kleber and now in Romer, the court does something different. Okay? Where am I? So Carlo, as best as you can you walk me through Justice Kennedy's analysis? As best as you can. We can start. We'll probably take a couple people, but just start walking me through.
Well, Justice Kennedy's analysis was pretty much that the 14th Amendment, hold on one second. Let me gather myself here. Well, he was talking about Williams versus Lee Optical, saying that there may be justified basis, but
So what was Williamson v. Lee Optical? What was that case?
that one was where the Oklahoma passed the statute that required that the opticians or ophthalmologists, you know, it's kind of a battle between the two,
Very
and
good.
who is able to do the fittings and so on and so forth. Kind of, yes, who had the stronger lobbyists.
Yeah. And so in that case, did it matter whether there was actually any conceivable health reason why the ophthalmologist could, you know, fit the lenses but not the optician? Was there any actual reason why?
No, but it just had to make sense.
Yeah, right. So traditionally a rational basis review, as long as there's some reason that could make sense, even if it's not the real reason, the court would uphold it. Now, Carlo, what's his Kennedy do here? Does he apply the rational basis review from Williamson v. Optical? Williams v. Optical?
No.
No, he does not. What's his analysis?
It's too narrow and too broad. That it identifies persons by a single trait and then denies them protection across the board.
Very good. So the most important phrase in this entire opinion is this one, which I alluded to earlier. Bear desire to harm. And this comes from a case, I think from 1979 or 70, I might be off on the year, the late 70s, called Merino. Kevin, what does this mean, a bare desire to harm?
To me, it basically means that when they passed, or when they were trying to pass this amendment, the intention of the amendment was to harm that specific group of people, even though on its face it may seem otherwise.
What does bare mean? It's the full phrase. I deliberately didn't use it here, but here I'm giving the full phrase, right? Bear desire to harm. It's not like grizzly bear, right? What does bear mean here?
Plain, like it's there, it's right there.
Is there any other rationale why?
What do you mean?
When I say there's a bare desire to harm, does that allow that there might be some other motivations why the law was designed?
I believe so.
Dave, what do you think? If I say bare desire to harm, am I like, there might be some other efficiency rationales, or just that's it?
So, I mean, it's directly designed to harm.
Yeah. So let me tell you about the Merino case, right? Back in the 1970s, there was a problem involving hippies. Right? Just follow me here. Food stamps. You'd often have a lot of people living together in a home, a commune, if you will, and they were engaging in fraud over food stamps. And the government basically passed a law or regulation making it impossible for hippies to collect food stamps. I swear, if you actually look at the transcript, it actually looks like hippies. I'm not making this up. And the opinion for the court said, look, let's be real here. This is not a law aimed at improving governmental efficiency. This is a law designed to basically harm hippies and a bare desire to harm them. And as a result, it violated the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment. But in other words, that there was no meaningful reason why this law was enacted except to basically harm these individuals. But the important word there is not just desire to harm, but also bare. Bare, or maybe naked, you could use, saying that the only reason why is for harming them, which brings us back to our question for the day. What happens when a law has multiple motivations and that people who vote for it, some maybe are concerned about employment law, some are concerned about, just support traditional marriage, whatever else. Under the rational basis test, it doesn't matter. As long as there's some good reason why to uphold it, you uphold it. But not here, Evan. Why does Kennedy not apply the traditional rational basis review in Romer?
Well, I think what he's saying is, he couldn't identify any other legitimate purpose or discrete evidence why they would do it other than discriminating.
Very good. So unlike Justice Scalia, who does find some legitimate bases to uphold this law, Justice Kennedy, as Evan said a minute ago, does not. He says that this law was designed to impose a disability on specific classes of people, gays and lesbians. And because it's only about imposing a disability on this one class of people, it's unconstitutional. Okay? So now, actually, we're supposed to be, that's why I'm calling you. That's fine. Did Kelsey never come for cupcakes?
Yeah, she's not, I'll see them earlier.
Oh, that's so sad. And she has a bag on her seat and everything? Yeah. Anyway, so Ashley, if I had told you about this case, a few weeks ago, right? And I told you there's a law that treats gays and lesbians differently, which clause of the Constitution do you think you'd be applying here? Right? If there's a law that treats gays and lesbians differently, what clause of the Constitution do you think you want to apply for state law?
Equal protection.
Very good, right? So you want to apply the Equal Protection Clause. Okay? And we know, we talked about this before, under the Equal Protection Clause, what's our usual framework, right? What question do we usually ask first when we get to the Equal Protection Clause? What's our framework? Yeah, what's our classification? Is it suspect or not? Okay? Does the court here talk at all about whether gays and lesbians and sexual orientation is a suspect classification? Is there any discussion at all? No, there's not. So the court basically says we're going to apply a rational basis review, right? They reference footnote 4, but we don't go outside our rational basis review. But here, the court says that this law, and this is a quote, can only be explained by animus. Can only be explained by animus. And therefore it lacks a rational relationship to a legitimate state interest. Crystal, what does this phrase mean that the law can be explained only by animus? What does this phrase animus mean? You'll see it a lot. You next? Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. She's giving me the no. Adam, you're next. Shit. Last week of class, huh? I had a professor when I was a 1L he wasn't very good, but he was a torts professor, and like the last day of class he hands up the evaluations, and then like he gets it back and goes, all right, let's do some mother effing torts, and like he just, because he already put his evaluations in. He's not a professor anymore. I am. I'm still here. Adam, what does this phrase animus mean?
I got nothing.
You got nothing?
Yeah.
Brandon?
Animus is like extreme dislike, hostility,
Hatred, maybe?
Hatred.
Yeah, hatred,
Bigotry.
yeah. So, in the context of this law, Brandon, this Amendment 2, what exactly is the animus? At least in Kennedy's mind.
Well, Kennedy's saying the fact that you would make this call obviously indicates that you have hatred towards this group, this class of people.
So by voting for Amendment 2, he's saying that people have hatred in their
You're a
hearts.
bigot, yeah.
You're a bigot, okay. Is that necessarily the case?
No, I mean, I don't think it is.
Well, but at least, yeah, so why not?
Well, I think you can have strong convictions about something and present those in a legal, even loving way, and disagree with someone but not hate them. Disagree
Right.
with somebody.
So this comes up, you'll see a lot more in Obergefell and also in Windsor, right? Where there's one line, to borrow your phrase, Chief Justice Roberts writes that to say someone acts of animus is to tar them with the brush of bigotry, right? That to argue that this is motivated by animus has the necessary consequence of saying the people who voted for this thing are hateful, like Brennan said. The flip side of this is people who voted for this did in fact enact legislation that directly impacted a specific class of people in a negative way. That is, if you were a gay or lesbian person living in Denver, you had certain legal protections, and the consequence of this amendment was to withdraw those protections, was to take them away and yank them away. But this concept, these two phrases, this desire to harm and animus, I want you to focus on them as we study the remainder of the class today. So the court purports to give rational basis review, but they said there is no conceivable basis why the statute would be enacted except for animus, except for desire to harm. That those are the only conceivable bases why this statute could be enacted. And we discussed before, it's probably not the case, perhaps some other reasons why, but the court says that those aren't legitimate. Okay? Oh, wow. Yeah, so, Aaron, the court also makes a big deal about the fact that this sort of law is unprecedented, that something like this has never happened before. Why Why do you think that's important to the court?
Because they usually like to look for kind of historical.
Very good. And the absence or the lack of historical precedent where you single out one class of people suggests what?
That it's denying equal protection.
Yeah. In other words, if this has never been done before, it's probably not valid, right? You can't find any example of any legislation or an amendment that targets a specific group to deprive them of their rights. That's a signal that this is probably not a valid act. Okay? So in the end, you don't get what you want. You don't say that sexual orientation is a suspect classification. They don't say that engaging in sodomy is a fundamental right. The court says under rational basis review that this specific ordinance lacks any rational basis. Now, Boone, let me ask you a question. If Romer holds that singling out gays and lesbians for this sort of treatment lacks any rational basis, what about a law that says marriage is defined as a union between one man and one woman? And that's the law that's enacted. Why is it any different than Colorado's ordinance? Is it? Is it not?
Would you go into marriage being a fundamental right?
I didn't say anything about fundamental right. All I'm saying is you have a law that says we single out men and women get married only, and we find that opposite sex marriage is not allowed. I'm sorry, same sex marriage is not allowed.
I mean, there's
In other words, is a traditional marriage law motivated by animus? Is a traditional marriage law motivated by bigotry? According to this rubric.
according to Kennedy, yes.
It's what do you think?
So, one of the things that Kennedy talks about is how many different things are affected by this law, and that it can be housing, it can be employment, it can be so many different things. And I think that he might argue that it could be different because that's one specific right versus a law that doesn't allow you to protect them in any situation.
Well, let me change the hypothetical. When you're married, you get tax deduction, right? You get spousal housing. You get, you can adopt children, right? There are a lot of things that come along with marriage. So, is there a difference here?
Personally, I don't think so.
So, I want you to understand the Kennedy majority and the Scalia dissent as a game of cat and mouse, right? Where you always have, Scalia, the cat, chasing Kennedy, and he never quite catches him. And he said, like, you guys, don't be stupid, right? If you accept Romer, then gay marriage is just somewhere, right? You don't have it right away, but it's right there. And Kennedy just ignores it, pretends it doesn't happen. This is one thing about Kennedy that drives me bonkers. He never responds to the dissents. Ever. Not a word. Not a word. You won't see it in Romer, Lawrence, Windsor. Bergerfeld just does not respond to any dissenting opinions. And let me tell you, when you're reading it, it matters. Because you have a majority saying X, a dissent pointing at criticism, and the majority just ignores it. That's significant. That's the one thing about Kennedy that I can't stand. He doesn't acknowledge people disagree with him, just ignores it. Right? So that's Kennedy's majority opinion. Other things about it I can tolerate. I've come to like his writing. It's grown on me over the years, like a tumor. But it's grown on me. But he does not respond. People disagree with him.
What difference would it make if he responded?
Because if his response is feeble, it shows.
What does it show? Is it going to change anything?
Oh yes, these were all 5-4 cases. Or some of them were, right?
So another case would have to come through, and then they would use the disagreement.
Yeah. So think of some of the some of the classic dissents we've studied, right? The Carlin dissent in the civil rights cases, or Plessy, right? He was only alone, but he had these really sharp points that no one responded to. And then 50 years later, someone said, aha, see, no one actually responded to this dissent. And as a result, we are embracing dissent. Now, I don't expect this case to be overturned, that's not my point. But when you don't ever respond to your weakest points, people assume that your point is even weaker. You know, if you're ever writing a brief, for example, right? You're all going to be legal writing, appellate writing, right? If your other side has a good point, you need to address it. If you write a brief and your other side has a good point, you just ignore it, the judge is going to simply assume that you have no response and you lose. Now, when you're justice, no one's grading your brief, right? That doesn't happen. I guess we do as students and as lawyers, but when you're a justice and you don't even acknowledge that there's some weaknesses in your position, it allows your dissenter to say, aha, see, they couldn't even respond, they had nothing on me, they had no response. Now, as a practical matter, it makes no difference, he has 5 votes. In this case, I think he had maybe 6, but 5 or 6, whatever it happens to be. But opinions that can't acknowledge that there might be weaknesses often have this problem. Even when Ginsburg dissents or writes a majority opinion, Scalia dissents. Remember the VMI case, the Virginia case? Ginsburg goes back and forth with Scalia a bit. They always go back and forth, and I actually truly appreciate that because you get to see how really smart people can engage ideas. But Kennedy is just, you know, like Moses, that sign, I hear it is, right? Take it. Zach?
So what is the majority's decision like not to recognize gays as a suspect class? Is that like a compromise between the courts, or is it just because Kennedy doesn't?
Well, I think later on I would say the answer is he doesn't like suspect classes, but had they actually said that sexual orientation is a suspect classification, the marriage laws would fold right away. And in fact, a number of state Supreme Courts in Iowa, Massachusetts, I might be blanking on one others, actually held under the state constitution, the state equal protection clauses, they were suspect classes. So actually, the same logic which you described, Zach, were in state courts. So had the U.S. Supreme Court come out, pun intended, had the U.S. Supreme Court said that gays and lesbians were suspect classifications, then you have to go to saying that marriage laws were invalid. You can't keep that up. It wouldn't have worked. So maybe it's a compromise, but I think later on you would learn that Kenny just doesn't care about these things. Is there any other questions in the majority opinion, Romer? I think Jackson, you're next. Walk me through Scalia's dissent. We alluded to it earlier. I think Andre and Mark read it a little bit earlier, but what's Scalia's dissent here?
Well, I guess he doesn't think that it's that their desire to harm this law. He thinks it's, I guess these people are trying to preserve like the traditional sense of everything and the traditional sexual remorse against the efforts of a politically powerful minority.
Yeah, that's one hell of a line, isn't it?
Yeah.
But what case does Scalia cite, which you guys studied last week, which says that the sort of moral disapproval of homosexuality is a legitimate rational basis? What case does Scalia cite over and over again? Bowers, right?
Yeah.
Bowers held, and we read this case last week, or whatever it was. I don't have any track of time anymore. I really don't. I was here till 9 last night. It was my last student. But anyway, Bowers held that in terms of a rational basis, moral disapproval of homosexuality by itself, nothing more, that was a rational basis. You didn't need anything else, right? You didn't show anything else. In other words, if you walked into court and said, we are passing this law because we don't like gays and lesbians, we think they should be discouraged from engaging in these acts, that would have been enough. But Scalia says, wait a minute, how do you write this opinion without even acknowledging Bowers? You don't even cite it, let alone overturn it. So this contradicts Bowers. And if you notice, he wrote, I vigorously dissent. The adjective a justice uses when they say I dissent is very important. So usually you see I respectfully dissent, right? You always see that I respectfully dissent. Here, Scalia says I vigorously dissent, right? I can really, he's really angry here. You can really tell he's not happy. Okay? But the desire, right, to preserve traditional mores was acceptable in Bowers. But here the court starts to chip away at this. Chip away. And he says, don't do yourself any don't lie to yourself, right? That this is more or less paving the way for gay marriage. And it was. The lawyers who argued this case knew what they were doing. They were trying to get the court to entertain this issue. Perhaps they didn't quite appreciate how long it would take. They thought maybe it would take, 30, 40 years. Who knew? But it happened much quicker. Okay. All right. So any other cases on Romer, right? Romer basically established the rule that when there's a bare desire to harm, that is not a rational basis to act. This holding hasn't really been applied much outside of the context of Romer, but that was the rule at least in 95 or 96. Kevin, yes, sir.
Seeing that gay marriage did come around and pass through the Supreme Court and won, in your opinion, what about polygamy? Because Scalia touched on that a little bit. Do you think if we would have a polygamy case come to the Supreme Court, would it have the
They
same?
turned it away.
Oh, they did turn it away?
Yeah, so the Sister Wives, the show? It's on TLC, I think. I mean, they're not truly polygamists because they're not allowed to get married, but they're basically people who hold themselves out to be polygamists. Polygamous, poly, many, gamist, marriage, right? As opposed to monogamous, mono meaning one rail, right? Monorail. So, polygamy, right? If you can't exclude people from same-sex relations, why multiple relations? In fact, we'll add one more. The notion of same-sex marriage is fairly recent. It didn't exist about 15 years ago. Polygamy goes way back to biblical times. There are cultures to this day around the world that have had continuous traditions of polygamous marriages for thousands of years. So if anything, the argument for polygamous marriages is a lot stronger than for gay marriage. I think it's Joseph Alito's dissent or Robert's dissent. I can't remember which one. One of the dissents in a Bergefell actually mentions polygamy and says this is coming next. But of course, the court just denies cert on a polygamy case. Emily, yes, ma'am.
The last line of Scalia's dissent, I think it's Scalia, yeah. He alludes to the majority's motivation for striking down the act is based on political will. Is he alluding to, promoting the idea of gay marriage?
So what he's responding to is that there was a fairly, Andre, was the word used, homosexual agenda?
Yeah.
Right? It's a phrase that you just don't hear anymore, but was fairly common back in the day, that there's a fairly influential political group trying to make these sorts of changes, both at the ballot box and in the courts. And Scalia is saying is that this is not a proper application of constitutional law, but rather the majority is bending to this political force. And they're being basically shamed into thinking that if you oppose this force, you're a bigot. This is, I think, Brandon's point from a couple minutes ago. Yes, ma'am.
So back to my initial question in the beginning, just want to make sure my understanding is clear. When we're analyzing something like this, are we going down the line of, okay, does strict scrutiny apply here? Is there suspect classification? No. Okay, well, is there a fundamental right? No. Okay, so we apply rational basis. Is there a rational basis sufficient? Yes or no?
You just stated it so well, and that's the correct answer. It's the correct answer the court doesn't apply, but I want you to actually go through those things, right?
Okay.
Unfortunately, you have to handle it the same way if you were a constitutional lawyer writing a brief, right? Even though the court doesn't talk about scrutiny, if you're writing a brief to the Supreme Court, you still have to talk about it, even though they won't cite it. So you basically have to write this lengthy brief with all these things about scrutiny and suspect classification. It doesn't matter. In a Bergefell, there were probably 100, guessing it, that 100 briefs were filed, all arguing that sexual orientation classification are suspect classes. The court didn't touch it, but you still have to make these arguments. So other questions on Romer? Other questions on Romer? This was a really big case before Lawrence, and after Lawrence it was a lot less important. So it was a very big case.
So could you
Yeah,
say,
do you, Richard? Yeah. Thank you.
The Supreme Court, based off of the language on 1029 pulled from Amendment 2 directly, it seemed like the Supreme Court started kicking tires that the state of Colorado didn't intend to be kicked. It was, they turned it into something that it wasn't, really. And to use your language from before, they began to pave the road towards gay marriage, and kind of used this amendment as a pawn in order to be able to get there.
So what do you mean they were kicking tires in a way it wasn't meant to be kicked? Just explain a little bit more what you mean by that, please.
Well, they made it so much about, morality and, the evil nature, what it was the language that was used, bare desire to harm, when in actuality the state of Colorado was very progressive historically, especially in that subject. They were one of 25 states at that time to not have a law against sodomy relationships. In fact, they were one of the first states to put away the law against that. And Scalia gave a couple of other examples to say that for this court to describe Colorado of all places to be anti-homosexual behavior is comical.
Yeah, I think this is Brandon's point as well, right? Unlike a legislature that you have some sort of legislative history that votes, here you have people going to the polls and they just flip a switch. You don't know why people vote the way they did, but the consequence of this decision is to say that people who voted for this were bigots. That's the only way to understand it.
Right.
And your point is that there's evidence that the state wasn't in this fashion.
In fact, you could almost bring up from Grutter when Justice Thomas brought up Frederick Douglass. Your interference is doing him positive injury. I think that the state of Colorado is such a place that allows people to stand on their own ground, and everyone should be treated equally.
Do you know where the first gay marriage in the United States was performed?
I guess Colorado.
Boulder. So this is actually a fascinating case. I don't remember the couple's name, but you basically had, I think a guy basically dressed in drag, and he went to a clerk's office in Boulder, and I'm pretty sure I'm right as Boulder. Google this. I think the first ever marriage was in the 1970s. And you had a guy dressed in drag with another guy, and they got a marriage license. It was since revoked, right?
Did
It was
they know?
actually what?
Did they know he was in drag, or they think he's a woman?
The clerk may have been in on it.
Oh.
I think they may have been in on it. But if I remember correctly, just someone Google this. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. The first ever same-sex wedding in the United States was actually in Boulder, which is where the campus of the University of Colorado is hosted. Am I right? Martin?
That's your job.
Leave him alone. Leave him alone. He's paying attention to class. It's fine. Don't make him Google. All right. Any other questions on Romer? Any other questions on Romer? All right. Let's go to the next case, Lawrence, which is a case you've probably all heard of. As the name suggests, it's from Texas, and you may have not known this, but it's actually from Houston. So I'm going to give you, thank you, Rosario, for not bringing your daughter today. I'm going to give you the facts of this case. The actual facts of this case are almost certainly not what the casebook described. So let me read this to you. In the standard account in 1998, 4 sheriff deputies from Harris County PD, responding to a false report of someone waving a gun, entered an apartment and after identifying themselves found 2 men, Tyrone Garner, and a John Lawrence, enthusiastically violating the Texas sodomy law. This is an account from a book I read. Both men had been drinking and Lawrence was aggressive, the deputies reported. Joseph Quinn, the lead officer, had several options. He could warn the 2 and let them go. He could charge them and issue a citation, or he could arrest them and haul them to jail. He chose door number 3, which set Lawrence v. Texas in motion. But the actual facts are very, very different. So again, this is a Lawrence, and they asked him whether he actually was engaging in any sex act, and he said, quote, "My God, we didn't have sex." So follow me here. Of the 4 officers who entered the apartment, 2 did not note any sexual encounter. The other 2 gave conflicting reports. Thank you for not bringing your daughter today. One recalled oral sex, and the other recalled anal sex. You can't confuse the 2. I'll leave it at that. So, what's clear though is that Quinn, the lead officer, had a reputation for turning minor disturbances into major confrontations. And he apparently was furious at Lawrence. Don't also deny the fact that this was an interracial couple. That also probably played into it as well. Now, what actually happened, I've done even some more digging on this case, is apparently Garner had a boyfriend of sorts that was mad at him for being with Lawrence. And I mentioned before, someone made a police report, called 911. Apparently, the person who called 911 was Garner's ex-boyfriend. And he basically called and said, oh, there's a black guy with a gun in this apartment. And he was basically setting up his boyfriend for sleeping with Lawrence. This is getting a little bit more towards the, page 6, like TMZ style, but I'm on fairly safe ground. I think this is probably what happened, because someone put a police report in. These guys were just there together. And they weren't probably naked, but they weren't engaging in a sex act at the time. I'll leave it at that. But anyway, they were not actually engaging in what the statute prohibited. They weren't. They were brought to the prison. They were charged. They pleaded what's called no contest. No contest is not pleading guilty, it's not pleading not guilty. And they were fined, given a fine. The consequence of a no contest plea is that you can challenge your conviction in court. Now, there hadn't been a prosecution for sodomy in Texas in like over a decade. They just don't happen very often, for obvious reasons. Usually cops don't walk in the act to see people having sex. It just doesn't happen. But they were here charged, and the big mistake was the Harris County DA, a guy named Chuck Rosenthal. He was intent on prosecuting this case. Now, any competent DA would have said, I am not bringing this case. Even in Bowers, remember we said, the prosecutor said, I am not bringing this case. So your public official, Chuck Rosenthal, decided to actually prosecute this case. It gets worse for Mr. Rosenthal. He turned in what is probably the worst Supreme Court argument in modern history. Now, usually when the Harris County DA goes up to the Supreme Court, they let the Texas AG argue it. At the time, Abbott was Attorney General. He'd argued cases. Our Solicitor General is a guy named Ted Cruz. He could have argued a case as well. He's very good. Ben said Roosevelt said he'll keep it himself. If you ever want to see what not to do during an oral argument, listen to this guy. He was so bad. At one point, Justice Scalia and Breyer were basically talking back and forth to each other because this guy was not helping at all. And the chief said, maybe we should go through counsel. At another point, Breyer said, I want a straight answer from you. Okay? If a judge ever goes to you, I want a straight answer, you will do something really wrong. And at one point, Scalia said to the lawyer, don't fall into a trap. Right? He even said that. There was one point where Justice Ginsburg asked, under Texas law, can gay couples adopt children? And he said, I don't know. I can ask all of you that question. You know the answer, right? He said, yeah, Justice Ginsburg, I don't really know the answer. So he didn't prepare, or if he did, he claims that he prepared. He said, here's his quote, I didn't do as well as I'd like, but we had a great brief. I'm laughing, but it's sad because it didn't make any difference in the outcome of the case at all. But I give you a Houston connection. Also, I think he's a South Texas alum as well. Yeah, so there it is. Thank you. You ready to Google that?
From last class.
Oh, damn it! She looks at my old lectures. That's right. Thank you. Did I miss anything? Did I hit all the good points? See, I don't always hit the same
And
points.
he's probably the worst district attorney in the history is one of the things that was made.
Yeah. I think that's probably right. Kevin, did I miss anything else?
No picture from where it all happened? Because you do with pictures. I'm just
I could probably. They don't have cameras in the court, but they do have sketches. So I
in the scene where the scene.
No, there are no police photographs of the scene. But this is Lawrence and Garner. I think I have a couple other pictures of them. But anyway, so there it is. Thank you, Emily, for keeping me honest, keeping me consistent. Okay. So anyway, he was really bad. Just listening to the arguments, it was absolutely terrible. It was really, really bad. Attorney General Abbott was saying, please, let's argue this case. Let's argue this case. And he would have kept it himself. Okay. Brittany, I already gave you the facts, but at least run me through the case, at least as Justice Kennedy describes it, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, he opened up by talking about the state's role in the home
Good.
and, that there's certain spheres of our lives that the state shouldn't and can't touch.
Okay, let me stop you right there, Brittany. It's a good point. What cases discuss this idea of privacy in the home? What cases have you studied for that are brought up here?
The cases that they mentioned?
Yes, ma'am.
They mentioned Roe v. Wade as well, one of them.
Good.
They mentioned, and all of them didn't cover, but they mentioned Griswold.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for, right? Why is Griswold an important case here?
Because it talks about what's done inside the home.
Good.
Regardless of status, married.
Good.
They talked about marriage specifically there. It was
Yeah.
about marriage.
You anticipate my next question, which I'll give to Alyssa, right? Griswold was about this right of married couples whose contraception in the bedroom, and they later said married or not doesn't matter. Does Griswold provide the rule for Lawrence by itself? Is Griswold enough?
I don't know if it's enough, but it lays down the foundation of the right to privacy.
But why was the marital bedroom, or at least in Griswold, so important?
Well, because it explains the right to privacy, but it doesn't really fully extend to Lawrence because this is a homosexual couple that's
Oh, so why? But just answer my question first. Why did the court think that what goes on in the marital bedroom is so important, so fundamental? To use the words of the day.
Because they said that the sanctity of marriage should be.
What was marriage important for?
Procreation.
Procreation, right? They described marriage as this old institution that was essential for procreation. That you could make a credible argument that under the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause, that procreation and the stuff that comes before it, sex, right, is part of our constitutional order. That if we don't have sex and procreate, we die as a species. It happens very quickly, right? So zombie virus that makes us all sterile, we're done in a couple of years, right? We don't last very long. But here, I think Alyssa flagged the second point, which is, does that extend to same-sex relations? Without intervention of science, same-sex couples can't procreate. It can't be done. So what the court does here is shift from associating this liberty interest of procreation, and they shifted to something a little bit different, Portland. Where do they shift the foundation of this right to? It's not about procreation anymore, about the sanctity of marriage. They shifted somewhere else.
They shifted to the relationship besides the sex.
Good. Tell me more. Exactly right.
They're saying that ours was insensitive to, I guess, the true extent of your liberty interest you have in a relationship with someone else.
Good. Keep going a little bit more.
That prohibiting homosexual sodomy was, in effect, saying that just being in a homosexual relationship was bad.
Yeah, let me read you from the very first paragraph, of opinion. It says, liberty. He loves starting opinions with liberty, right? Liberty finds a refuge, judgment doubt. Here we go. Liberty protects the person from unwarranted government intrusion into a dwelling or other private places. In our tradition, the state is not omnipresent in the home, and there are other spheres of our lives and existence outside the home where the state should not be a dominant presence. Okay, here it comes. Freedom extends beyond spatial bounds. I don't know what that means. Liberty presumes an autonomy of self that includes freedom of thought, belief, expression, and certain intimate conduct. Let me pause on that one for a second. I think Cortland was alluding to this a minute ago. It's not just about the sanctity of marriage, which leads to procreation. It's about the intimate conduct itself, which is protected. And this case involves the liberty of the person, both in its spatial and its more transcendent dimensions. Right? So the focus here isn't just on procreation. the focus is on intimate conduct, right? So Mark, what's the significance of shifting from procreation and sanctity of marriage to intimate conduct? Why is that an important change?
I guess it's shifting away from strict scrutiny over to, or maybe it's the other way around, switching from strict scrutiny over to rational basis.
Well, no, don't think of it in terms of scrutiny, right? Why do you think Justice Kennedy can't develop this right to sodomy on the basis of tradition, in the same way you can look to the procreation issue in Griswold?
Because I guess I don't know, I guess I saw like a lot of, it's almost like he took Scalia's opinion, dissenting opinion to heart, switched gears a little bit.
There's no tradition of a right to sodomy.
That's the answer, right? You can say there's a deeply rooted tradition of man and wife, husband and wife having sex to make kids, right? That goes back to the time of Adam, whatever, right? Not Adam and Eve, right? But when you're talking about sodomy, well, there isn't that same sort of tradition. It's not a historical right, so it becomes more of a modern right. And Justice Kennedy gets rid of any sort of desire to ground the Constitution in text and history. It's irrelevant, right? What he's saying is the idea of what intimate conduct is something that develops over time. And we can look at different factors to determine whether that intimate conduct is something that should be protected. And he goes through this. He looks at international sources. He looks at modern legislation. He looks at the fact that states have been repealing their sodomy statutes, right? So for Justice Kennedy, again, he has a method there. There's certainly a method. But what he's saying is we can't limit ourselves to rights that are deeply rooted in text and history. Instead, the notion of what intimate conduct is changes and evolves over time. So even while Roe, remember the quickening discussion, right? Roe tried to ground itself in at least some sort of historical practice. Kennedy makes nods to that, but basically says, like in Brown, history doesn't really give me the answer we want, so we're going to go for it. Questions on that? So a few hands pop up. No hands? All right. So what he does note, I think that this is worth stressing, historically bans on sodomy weren't used to criminalize consensual acts, right? Imagine if a person committed a rape and the rape was anal. You charge him with sodomy. This is not that though, right? This is a fairly recent trend where consensual acts of non-vaginal sex were considered a crime. So that much is true, right? You can't deny it that much. But then he says, there is a history of condemnation of homosexual conduct, and that goes back centuries. You know, the Bible, it's an abomination, all those sorts of things. So what Kennedy has to say is basically, all that stuff is in the past, right? We are now, as a society, moving forward and progressing, and we're going to recognize that those sorts of traditional mores are no longer rational bases. So even if, at one point, those bases may have been valid, they're no longer valid. But Kennedy goes a step further and he says, no. Bowers was wrongly decided the day it was decided. Right? Bowers was wrong from the outset. It was always wrong. And he knows that based on what are fairly modern conceptions of relations. So this is a full-throated defense of a living Constitution that we can update and evolve the Constitution by looking to various other factors. He says, our obligation, the court, is to define the liberty of all. I mean, he's saying right there, we define what liberty is. It's a striking statement, right? When the court just says, we're going to define liberty. Not, he says, to mandate our own moral code. Mark,
that's what I was getting at. Like, isn't that exactly what Scalia said that he wasn't supposed to do in the previous opinion?
Yes. Yeah, at points, Kennedy's a caricature of himself, right? He's doing exactly what Scalia said he shouldn't do. which is why I describe it when the majority never responds to dissent, it shows how weak it is, right? It doesn't acknowledge the deficiencies. Yeah.
But isn't there a difference in creating policy that lets people be versus policy that stops somebody from doing something? And what he's saying is, like, to me, it says, hey, you know, we shouldn't impose a rule telling people they can't do something. I'm not even saying there's people saying they have to or they should. There just shouldn't be a rule saying they can't.
So
And
you're
that's the
drawing
imposition.
a distinction then between giving someone a marriage license and saying that a positive right, giving you a marriage license versus a negative saying you can't engage in this act. Is that what you're getting at?
Versus saying, well, so marriage, for instance, there's two different components, right? There's the legal act of being married, and then there's the religious act of being married. You shouldn't be able to make a law that says all churches and synagogues have to marry whatever, because they should have the right, because that's their belief. But from a government perspective, if two people want to have certain rights, and we determine, you know, who's to define what, who's to say what's okay and what's not from a moral perspective, and because we shouldn't judge it from a moral perspective, you know, I think this is where polygamy differs too. Polygamy might create complications, right? There's 5 or 6 people, who gets rights, who doesn't, is this possible from a financial standpoint and just from an oversight standpoint? But if you're still dealing with one-on-one, I would say the argument's more, it's not a matter of imposing my beliefs, it's stopping someone else's beliefs from stopping someone else from having their liberty and their freedom to live their life the way anyone else would want to live their life.
So which case holds that morality is not a rational basis? That purely based on laws based on morals is not a rational basis? What case is that?
The last one and this one.
This one, yeah,
Yeah,
right,
this one,
right.
yeah.
So yeah, exactly right. So once you say that morality and moral disapproval is not a rational basis, then you're absolutely right.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is to
But
just
why is that the case though? I mean, Kennedy said it, but why is that correct?
because they said so. You know?
Yeah. I mean, it is whatever he says it is, right?
But I think from a historical context, it does make sense as we understand our society better and as we understand the world better, our perception of things do change to some degree. You know, I mean, even in Judaism, for instance, the rules of kosher, a lot of people argue people kept kosher because it was healthier. There were animals that you couldn't keep, and it was just an easy way to tell people, hey, God says do this, so they wouldn't have mass sickness and then death. But I think that to some extent, even our founding fathers dealt with that. You know, a lot of them being philosophers and looking at the world the way they did, that was their understanding of the world at the time. And as time goes on, it would make sense that as our understanding of the world and interactions, and even historical basis of how we within our society interact with each other commences, that we would use that to make determinations.
And that's very much Kennedy's approach, right? He says, look, if you look at the number of states that have legalized sodomy, if you look at countries around the world that have legalized sodomy, there's a growing trend in awareness, an emerging, I think he used the phrase emerging awareness of a greater recognition of the rights of gays and lesbians. Now, who's next? Crystal, you next? Crystal, how would Justice Scalia respond to this growing awareness? What would he say?
He would say that everything's a liberty interest.
Well, how would Scalia say, if in fact there's a growing awareness, how should this change be developed then?
In the legislature.
Right. So the debate is, I think, Jason, you make a very, very, very strong point. If in fact this growing awareness exists, is it up to the court to define this liberty or for the people to define this liberty? Scalia often makes his point, like, I couldn't care less about abortion or same-sex marriage. That's probably not true, right? But he always says this. The issue here is, Kennedy says that our obligation as justice is to define liberty in the different way that people of Texas define it. Now, again, if Chuck Rosenthal hadn't, that's why I'm so mad at him, if he hadn't brought this stupid case, we wouldn't have this opinion, right? I mean, maybe some other state would have. Maybe it would have popped up somewhere else. But this is a law that simply just wasn't enforced. It was just never enforced. And it basically had a cop who I think made a mistake. He observed something that probably didn't happen. Or maybe he made it up. Cops do lie. That does happen. And you had a prosecutor who decided, I want to get reelected on this thing. And he took this up to the court. Yes, sir.
What seems interesting to me is that it seems like Kennedy supplants the traditional moral code for his own moral code, how he would define liberty of all. In my understanding, it seems like that's kind of his biggest line.
Brennan, can I ask you a follow-up? Does Kennedy say that I'm doing this because I think it's right, and this is what Anthony Kennedy thinks is right? Is he just saying I'm doing whatever I think is right?
I think so, based on his own interpretation of what liberty means.
But doesn't he cite other things to develop this emerging awareness like Jason was talking about?
Other cases?
The funny part is he cites other cases that he wrote. By the time you get to Obergefell, he says, well, as the court held in Casey, Romer, Lawrence, and Windsor, right? He wrote all of them, right? He's citing himself. It's like saying, it's like basically citing your own Facebook post to justify your briefs, right? Ashley, your hand was up a minute ago.
So I thought that Kennedy had a reputation for citing like whatever is kind of like the popular opinion of the.
I don't think that. I give credit to Kennedy more than perhaps some do. I think he genuinely believes that his job as a justice is to, perceive these changes in society and be like an oracle, right? That he's bringing in all these forces and he's channeling it through opinions. I don't think he's acting as like a political actor. I really don't. I think he genuinely believes this. If you go back and you watch his confirmation hearing from 1987, which of course I've watched, like, he was saying all the stuff about dignity. He was saying everything then 30 years ago. Like, he had these beliefs that were, I think, very sincerely held. But I'll answer your question different now, actually. His opinions do follow the polls, right? If he had tried to legalize gay marriage in 1996 after Romer, there would have been an impeachment proceeding. I think there would have been. If he had tried to legalize gay marriage in 2003 after Lawrence, I think there would have been a massive backlash. We may have had a constitutional amendment, which I think probably would have passed. In fact, there's this rumor, which is not true, but the Defense of Marriage Act, which we'll study in the next case, was passed, 95 or 96. There's this rumor that President Clinton signed it because he was afraid of a movement to amend the Constitution to prohibit gay marriage. What had happened was the Hawaii Supreme Court had ruled that under the state constitution, you were required to give gays and lesbians what called civil unions, right? And this was a massive backlash. There was actually a movement to amend the U.S. Constitution to prevent an amendment to deny gay marriage. So there's a rumor that circulated that President Clinton signed DOMA to prevent this amendment. There's actually no evidence of this. He signed it very quietly in his office without any cameras. He wasn't proud of it, later said he regretted it. But it would have been very strange if Kennedy ruled back then. So by the time the court got to 2015 for Obergefell, I think about 10, 11 states had legalized gay marriage already. A number of the courts had ruled. At that point, they were at the point of no return. He couldn't go back, so it was almost a formality. But he laid the groundwork for it years earlier in Lawrence and Windsor. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question on Kennedy's majority opinion? Eric, let's talk briefly about stare decisis, right? Liberty finds a refuge in a jurisprudence of doubt, right? Our favorite line. What does Kennedy do to Bowers here?
Yeah, he overturned it, so it was unconstitutional.
Yeah, and it wasn't even, 20 years old, 17 years old? And he wasn't that old.
Yeah.
How does Kennedy reconcile Bowers and Casey with the discussion of stare decisis?
So he was saying that Bowers was mistakenly, the court in Bowers mistakenly framed the issue that it should have been, the issue wasn't whether the Constitution protected homosexual sodomy, it was whether the Constitution protected a person's intimate personal relationships. And so basically it wasn't even a matter of stare decisis. It was this is a completely different case because we're not talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, one point he makes, which I do think is accurate, is that no one relied on Bowers, right? After Bowers decided, gay men continued having sex, people did rely on Roe, right? Women did engage their lives in a way that they were expecting abortion to be available if needed. So one point he raised, which I think is a fair point, is that people haven't detrimentally relied, estoppel, right? They haven't relied to a detriment on Bowers. So overturning it doesn't have the sort of cost. But Scalia is just livid about having just gone through this entire discussion of stare decisis in Casey a couple years earlier, or a decade earlier, I guess, and then he just tossed it out. At the very end, after they overturned Bowers, the court says, this case does not involve whether the government must give formal recognition to any relationship that homosexual persons seek to enter. No one actually believed that. Maybe Kennedy did. No one else, I think, actually believed that. Because if you take this reasoning seriously, the rationales for marriage they crumble pretty quick. And on the second to last paragraph, the court says, the Texas statute furthers no legitimate state interests which can justify its intrusion into the personal and private life of the individual. That sounds something like a scrutiny standard, but not really. So, Adiyama just stepped out, but the short answer to the question is, this is a rational basis decision, and that's upheld. Any questions in the majority, Justice Kennedy? Yes, Rachel?
So I'm confused. Is this under Equal Protection Clause or is this under the Substantive Due Process Clause?
That was my next question for Martin.
Oh.
Do you want it? You can take it.
Go ahead, Martin.
Martin, let's answer Rachel's question. That was literally my next question. Betwixt two ferns, right? Martin, let me ask the question like this. What's O'Connor's concurring opinion?
Oh man, I was so focused on Scalia's. O'Connor's was that it should have been under the equal protection.
Good. Okay. Why?
Because this one applied only to sodomy with men.
Okay, good. So Martin's exactly right. Okay, here's the point. If you remember the statute in Bowers, the Georgia statute, it criminalized sodomy, period. Man, woman, woman, man, didn't matter, right? This one only criminalized sodomy between people of the same sex, and only two men. That's what I was talking about. So what O'Connor says is, we can strike this out on more narrow grounds, protection grounds, by saying it's a violation of gender discrimination. We have intermediate scrutiny for gender classifications, right? It treats men and women differently. That is, a man and a woman can engage in sodomy, but two men can't. Okay, so she strikes it down those grounds. But Martin, I'll finish up with you. What's the downside to O'Connor's opinion, right? What could Texas have done in response to that sort of decision?
Just adjust their law.
And do what?
Make it like Georgia's.
Criminalize all sodomy, yeah. So Kennedy acknowledges that, look, if we just rule on equal protection, Texas can reenact the exact same laws Georgia did. Which is why Kennedy says we must go ahead and reach the bigger constitutional issue under the Due Process Clause. So the answer to Lauren's question, majority opinion is about substantive due process. It's about defining a sexual intimate conduct right. Not fundamental, but there's a right to sexual intimate conduct under the Due Process Clause. Now, I think O'Connor makes the point of saying, look, why do we need to reach this much broader question, right? Why can't we just be judges and be a little bit neutral, be a little bit restrained? But it's Kennedy. He wants to go and reach the big question, right? Would Texas have actually enacted a ban that made husband and wives criminals for engaging in sodomy? Of course not. No, it wouldn't have happened, even in 2003. So the court could have struck this down on narrow grounds without reaching the difficult due process question under established doctrine. But that's never been Kennedy's concern. He just doesn't care about that stuff. Right? Also, Justice O'Connor says, where's this line? Here it is. Texas cannot assert any legitimate state interest here, such as national security or preserving the traditional institution of marriage, right? So she just throws that in there, saying the state still has an interest in preserving marriage. No one believed that either, not for a second. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. Okay, so questions on O'Connor. All right, Bahar, give us Scalia. What's Scalia's position here?
He basically says that it wasn't a fundamental right but an exercise in liberty, and
What's the difference, right? The 14th Amendment says you can't be deprived of liberty. Is that what the 14th Amendment says?
yes.
What does the 14th Amendment say? You have the Due Process Clause handy?
Not today. I usually do that.
I'll read it to you. The 14th Amendment says, always keep your Constitution close to your heart, right? It's true. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, Bahar, can a person be deprived of liberty? It says,
Yeah.
nope. When? Under what circumstances?
When there's a fundamental right.
No. It says, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. When can you deprive a person of liberty? What must you give them? Emily?
Due process.
Due process of law, right? So does Scalia think that all acts of liberty are just unconditionally protected by the Constitution?
No.
No. Okay, very good. So what Scalia says is, I will concede that engaging in sodomy is an act of liberty. No one disputes that. But the question is whether you can be deprived of that. That goes to the question of the due process of law. The majority of Scalia's majority of the dissent, but the bulk of Scalia's dissent is basically saying that once you go down this road, there's no stopping point. He lists, masturbation and adultery and bigamy and the entire list, bestiality. Oh God, my friend Andre. Yeah, what's that? Right? You're done. You're done with that, right? But I'll throw in suicide as well on that list. He says once you say that moral disapproval is no longer a rational basis to justify these sorts of laws, then all these other laws fall. And don't believe the majority that says this is not about marriage, because of course it's about marriage. Okay? He also criticizes the majority for failing to actually address doctrine, Yami's question some time ago, right? The court never says this is a fundamental right. It never says strict scrutiny applies. The court never says that sexual orientation is a suspect classification, therefore we never know that strict scrutiny applies. Either O'Connor or Kennedy make that point. So as a result, what are we left with, right? What are we left with? If a law limits your liberty, if it impacts your dignity, if it impacts intimate conduct, which is the word Kennedy uses, right? That makes it unconstitutional. Under the traditional rational basis review, does it survive? Absolutely. Okay. At the end, he has this line, which I think Aaron's most quoted before. He says, "Let me be clear." Right, when someone begins a sentence with "let me be clear," you know it's about to go bad. It's just never good. Never say that, right? Let me be clear that I have nothing against homosexuals or any other groups promoting their agenda through normal democratic means. Social perceptions of sexual and other morality change over time, and every group has the right to persuade its fellow citizens that its view of such matters is the best. That homosexuals have achieved some success in the enterprise is attested to by the fact that Texas is one of the few remaining states that criminalizes private consensual acts. But persuading one's fellow citizens is one thing, and imposing one's views in absence of democratic majority will is something else. He then looks to Canada, which has legalized gay marriage by that point, and he writes that today's opinion dismantles the structure of constitutional law that has permitted a distinction to be made between heterosexual and homosexual unions, insofar as formal marriage recognition is concerned. On the very last line, he wrote, "I dissent." There is no respect there. It's a simple I dissent. So questions about the Scalia dissent. This is where I think he realized he lost. Right? I think in Romer he thought maybe that he could actually win, but here he realizes the writing's on the wall. Yeah, Rachel.
It's not about Scalia's dissent, I'm sorry.
Please, whatever you want.
So, I keep thinking that if Kennedy would have argued equal protection instead of substantive due process, then he would have been able to sidestep, well, he would have been able to strike down the statute, but also he would have avoided a collision with Bowers. So
they could have struck down the Texas statute, but leave the Georgia statute in the books.
Right.
Like O'Connor did.
So what I'm wondering is, but he decides to take the hard road, which is weird for a Supreme Court. Usually they try to avoid ruling on like major constitutional issues.
You're right.
But here he like actually grabbed Bowers like by the horns and decided to like straight up say no, it's not good law anymore. So was this possibly a way for him to respond to the dissent in Bowers or in Romer? Like, why do that?
Well, I think Rachel raises a good point. The usual model of a judge is, as John Roberts tells us, minimalism. You don't reach for difficult constitutional questions unless you have to. And here O'Connor had a fairly narrow way of striking. Not narrow, but much more narrow. But Kennedy wanted to recognize his act of intimate conduct. I mean this sincerely. He doesn't care about clauses of the Constitution. It's actually secondary. When you read the Bergefell decision for class on Thursday, ask yourself, is this a violation of due process or protection? He never tells you. He discusses both interchangeably. When you read Windsor, he doesn't really describe it. So the sort of fact-bound approaches that matter to most judges don't matter to him. I'm looking forward to the day where he's not in the court anymore. I don't know who replaces him, better or worse, but this sort of approach is very hard to teach.
Yeah. It almost seems like judicial activism in a way.
Yeah, it's a phrase that doesn't have much weight. I don't know what that means, but I think what you can say is he's not concerned by the usual bounds of deciding only what's before you, not reaching beyond. The O'Connor opinion was just fine. And by the way, the other people who joined Kennedy's opinion did it willfully. There's this one line in Scalia's dissent, which I want you to pay attention to. He says, if there was ever a price for getting a fifth vote, I would put my head in a paper bag. Right? That the people who joined the majority opinion of Bergefell should put their head in a bag for giving that fifth vote. And in fact, when Scalia died at the Supreme Court, there were all these makeshift monuments and little tributes. And someone actually brought a stalk of broccoli, I think paper bags, and tribute to Scalia. I almost started crying at that one. Hard.
So there was a line towards the end of Scalia's dissent where he said, paraphrasing, it's totally cool if people make laws to oppress people if that's what they want in their generation, and then later generations will look back and be like, oh, this is totally oppression. And then like 2 lines later he said, people should always have the right to make whatever laws they feel are correct, even if they're oppressive. Is it, and so my understanding of what he's saying is that the Constitution isn't there to safeguard people's bigotry if they feel it's right.
Oh, so Martin, let me ask you this question, right? What does it mean to express moral disapproval of homosexuality? He uses this phrase over and over. What does it actually mean?
It means he thinks it's wrong.
But not just wrong. It's not just he's saying it's wrong. What about the conduct are they saying?
That it's unnatural?
It's immoral, sinful, right? And so what Scalia is saying is under the Constitution, the police power extends to basically saying, I am going to stop you from doing X because I think X is sinful. And Scalia is absolutely saying that that's permissible.
But he recognizes, essentially, that this is an oppressive law. My understanding of things like equal protection and, having a Bill of Rights at all...
What does Thomas say about the sodomy statute? Actually, that's my next question. I'll call on you further. What does Thomas say in his dissent?
I don't remember Thomas's dissent.
I'll find next.
Oh, yeah, you're next anyway. Yeah, go for it.
Uncommonly silly, and if he was a member of the Texas legislature, he wouldn't enact it.
So I think Thomas and Scalia probably agree that as a matter of policy, if they were in the legislature, they would probably not enact the statute. I think they agree it's oppressive. I think they would both say that there. I mean, Scalia had gay law clerks, right? It's not a secret. He had gay law clerks. It's known. So he understood that people that he closely worked with engage in these relations. But the question is whether these are things that should be eliminated by the legislative process or by the judiciary.
But is it not the purpose of the Supreme Court to safeguard people's rights? If they see something that they know is oppressive, is it not their job to stop it?
So let's go back to our first question for today, Martin, right? You have a law. The law has part of it to harm a group, bigotry, whatever synonym you want to use, but also it has the role of preserving traditional morals and to keep the status quo. You have a mixed law. Had Ted Cruz and not Mr. Rosenthal argue this, you have had a much better justification of why the state needs this law. But if we just say, if there's even part of this desire to harm, then that's our modern jurisprudence. And the equal protection clause you described is Kennedy's equal protection clause. Emily, you want to add something, please?
I was just going to also add that Scalia has been consistent that it's a question for the legislature, not the judiciary branch, because in Romer he says that this is basically undermining the political process that was invoked by voting. You know, the people of Colorado voted for the amendment.
Yeah, the political process, the Schuette case, remember did I sign that one? The Michigan affirmative action one? I didn't sign it.
We have the Chicago.
But no, I know. But there was a case from Michigan a couple of years ago where the voters amended the state constitution to prohibit affirmative action. In that case, Kennedy upheld it, even though people said the same token, singling out a specific group for unfair treatment. Let me do Windsor quickly. I recognize that the excerpt I gave you is not very good. I made the assignment before the book was published, which is always tricky. So the Windsor case arose in a fairly different situation. It involved Edie Windsor, who married Thea Spire. They were married in Canada. When Thea died in 2009, she left her entire estate to Windsor. As you will learn when you take federal income tax, a husband and wife have what's called the estate tax exemption. That when a husband or wife dies, the spouse inherits it, there's an exemption for estate tax. They weren't married in the eyes of the federal government, so that Edie Windsor paid a tax of over $300,000. She sued, seeking a refund of her tax, saying, look, you shouldn't charge this to me. The end result of the case is entirely predictable after Romer and Lawrence. The court said that moral disapproval is not a rational basis to justify treating opposite-sex couples and same-sex couples differently. Even though DOMA can be justified on the basis of creating a single standard of federal law and creating efficiency in the various federal agencies, that was not enough. Hey, Adam, what are you doing?
Put away my laptop.
Okay. You want to wait a minute? Thank you. We're not done yet. The rule there, though, was premised on, again, the due process clause, was also based on protection. Okay? Justice Kennedy's opinion in Windsor didn't specify that a fundamental right was at issue, as sodomy. The court didn't specify that sexual orientation is suspect classification. So now, in case after case, the court's basically ignoring the doctrine. But once you say that expressing disapproval of gays and lesbians and being in a union is not a rational basis, these laws stand no chance, right? The sort of equal protection clause that Martin described a minute ago is more or less what we have today. It wasn't some decades ago, but that's more or less what we have today under a case law. And in the end, the Supreme Court struck down provisions of the Defense of Marriage Act. And they said that this law was inspired by animus. But to go back to Brandon's point earlier, by saying this law is inspired by animus, what you're effectively saying is that the overwhelming majority of Congress, the President of the United States, Clinton at the time, and all the people who supported this law were basically bigots. And that has a consequence, right? That has a cost. When you say that law is motivated by animus, you basically, as the Chief Justice said, tarring people with the brush of bigotry. Now, once Windsor was decided, this is my segue to the next case for Thursday, lawsuits were filed immediately all over the country challenging various marriage laws. And the argument was this: if the federal government can't classify people separately based on same-sex versus opposite-sex marriages. Why should the states be able to? And within months of when Windsor was decided, I think the first one was about 5 or 6 months later, federal district courts began to invalidate various marriage laws in Utah and other states. And this created basically a free-for-all, right? One court after the other. And you probably remember it, you could read about it in the paper. Until finally in 2015, the case gets up to the Supreme Court. By that point, it was almost a foregone conclusion. You had gay marriage in more than half of the states in the union, some by the legislative process, some by state courts, most by federal courts. For the Supreme Court to actually ratchet back and say, no, 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 you guys can't get married, would have been a stunning holding. So Obergefell was, not much of a surprise. But the change that enabled that was by the two cases we did today, Romer and Lawrence. I want to show you one chart that I always show to my students. It's hard to convey how quickly the support for same-sex marriage grew. It's stunning. I mean, you're living through it, so you probably understand it. But in like maybe 10 or 20 years when I'm old and gray teaching this case, it'll be a lot harder for me to explain this point. Law professors, I get older, you stay the same age, right? Students are always roughly the same age. It's a fact of my life. But back in 2008, this is from 538, Nate Silver's old site, which was on the New York Times, the number of states which had a majority support for same-sex marriage, was basically about 10 states, right? And then in 2012, when Windsor was decided, it was basically half the states, okay? What was the forecast for when Texas would achieve majority support for gay marriage? 2020. So the forecast was Texas wouldn't hit majority support for gay marriage for 2020, 3 years from now. We never got to actually try this experiment because by 2015, the Supreme Court took this question out of the hands of the democratic process and resolved it. So we'll never quite know what would have happened, although my sense is these graphs are probably accurate. And if the court had perhaps not gone into it for a couple more years, you would probably have a majority of states allowing gay marriage for the democratic process. At that point, it's a foregone conclusion. But that didn't happen. And in the Windsor case, the excerpt I gave you shows there was a way to duck the case. The court could have just avoided the entire ruling because there was no proper party. I don't think the so-called BLAG, the Bipartisan Legal Advisory Group, was even properly before the case. Because the Obama administration decided not to defend the law, I think the case has just gone away and the courts have denied cert. But they took it, they kept it, and they decided it. Once again, as Rachel pointed, they reached for an issue where there's no standing, and they decided in the most complicated way possible. But they did so in a way that didn't really make anyone very happy. Okay, questions on Windsor? All right, so our summary for today, if I can. With Romer and Lawrence, the court begins to chip away at the framework for equal protection and due process. There's no identification of a suspect classification. There's no identification of a fundamental right. Rather, Justice Kennedy has this sort of hodgepodge approach which looks at dignity and bare desire to harm and intimate conduct, these various other phrases which he uses to say that something is unconstitutional. In terms of what you want to know for your exam, right? What's our test? What's our test? You should understand if there's a case involving gay, lesbian rights, you're probably going to have to apply the Kennedy framework. If it's a case that doesn't apply to gay and lesbian rights, you have to apply it anyway. Try to figure out how it fits in.
What kind of framework? I couldn't hear you.
Kennedy framework. Sorry, if they want me to define it to you, I can't do it again. It's exactly what I said. It's a hodgepodge approach. At least the virtue of the fundamental rights approach and the suspect classification approach has some consistency. You can actually say, this is a suspect class, this is not. This Kennedy approach doesn't have that clarity. Anything else? No?
You said to apply it to other things that don't involve LGBT rights.
Yep. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, that's the answer. Look, if you're a constitutional lawyer, that's exactly what you have to do. So you're
Anything else? All right, I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you so much.